In this episode, we're going to take the everyday idea of staying logged into a website and turn it into a clear security story you can reason about. When you sign into a web application and then click around without re-entering your password on every page, the site is using a session to remember that you already proved who you are. That seems simple, but underneath it is one of the most attacked areas of modern systems. Because if an attacker can steal, guess, or trick someone into using a session they control, they can often act as that user without ever knowing the password. Web sessions are not just a convenience feature. They are a central part of access control, and mistakes around them can make an otherwise strong login system meaningless. Today, we'll build a beginner-friendly understanding of cookies and tokens, why session security depends on protecting these values, and how attacks like cross-site request forgery, CSRF, and session fixation exploit common assumptions. The goal is not to memorize jargon, but to understand the mechanics so you can identify when a design is safe and when it is quietly fragile. To understand sessions, you first need a mental model of why they exist. Web traffic is mostly built on a pattern where each request is independent, meaning the server does not automatically remember what you did on the previous page. If you didn't add a session mechanism, every click would look like a brand new anonymous visitor, and the server would have no idea which account to show or which permissions to apply. A session solves this by creating a shared reference between your browser and the server that says, "This is still the same user who authenticated earlier." That reference can be stored in a cookie, a token, or a similar piece of data that the browser sends along with requests. The server then uses that piece of data to look up who you are and what you are allowed to do. The key security insight is that the session identifier becomes a kind of temporary master key because whoever holds it can often access your account as if they were you. So session security is really about protecting that identifier from theft and from being tricked into accepting the wrong one. Cookies are one of the most common ways to store session identifiers, and they're often misunderstood. A cookie is a small piece of data that a website asks your browser to store and then automatically send back when you make future requests to that site. That automatic sending is what makes cookies convenient for sessions, but it is also what makes them dangerous if they are not constrained properly. If a session cookie can be read by scripts on the page, it can be stolen by malicious code and used elsewhere. If a session cookie is sent over an unprotected connection, it can be intercepted by an attacker observing the network. If a cookie is allowed to be sent in too many contexts, it can be used in attacks where the browser sends it along with requests the user did not intend. So a cookie is not inherently secure or insecure. It is just a delivery mechanism whose safety depends on the rules attached to it and the overall site design. Tokens are a broader concept, and beginners often lump them together with cookies even though they are not the same thing. A token is a value that represents authorization, like proof that you authenticated or proof that you are allowed to perform certain actions. A token can be stored in a cookie, it can be stored in browser-accessible storage, or it can be held by a client application and attached to requests in a controlled way. Some tokens are opaque, meaning they are just random strings that the server understands, while others are structured, meaning they contain readable fields that describe claims like identity and expiration. The security story changes depending on where tokens are stored and how they are transmitted. If a token is accessible to scripts, it becomes vulnerable to theft through malicious script execution. If a token is sent automatically by the browser, it can become vulnerable to request forgery-style abuse. The key beginner habit is to ask, where is the session or token stored? Who can read it? And under what conditions does the browser send it? Now let's talk about what makes a session identifier safe, because the core requirement is unpredictability plus limited lifetime. A session identifier should be hard to guess, because if it is predictable, attackers can try to guess valid sessions and hijack accounts without stealing anything from a user. It should also be short-lived, because even strong secrets can leak, and reducing lifetime reduces the damage window. Session identifiers should be regenerated at important moments, especially after authentication, because that prevents an attacker from setting up a known session identifier before login and then writing that session after the victim authenticates. That last point leads us directly into session fixation, which is an attack where the attacker tries to force a victim to use a session identifier chosen by the attacker. If the site does not replace the session identifier upon login, the attacker can essentially preload a session and then wait for it to become authenticated by the victim. Session fixation is easier to understand when you think of sessions as labels rather than locks. Imagine an attacker creates a session on a site and gets a session identifier, then tricks a victim into visiting a link or using a browser state that causes that same session identifier to be used by the victim. If the victim logs in while still using that identifier, and the site keeps the same identifier instead of issuing a new one, the attacker can reuse it, and now they are effectively in the victim's authenticated session. The victim did nothing obviously wrong. They logged in normally. The failure is that the site treated the pre-login session identifier as trustworthy and did not rekey the session after authentication. A basic defense is to regenerate the session identifier on login and on other privilege changes, so that an attacker cannot predict or control the identifier that ends up representing the authenticated state. The deeper lesson is that authentication events must change the secret that represents identity. Otherwise, the system can be tricked into binding the wrong secret to the logged-in user. Cross-site request forgery is another major session-related attack, and it happens because browsers are helpful in ways that attackers can exploit. In a CSRF scenario, the attacker's goal is to cause your browser to send a request to a site where you are already logged in, using your session automatically, but doing so without your informed intention. For example, if you are logged into a bank site and you visit a malicious page, that page might try to trigger a transfer request to the bank site. Your browser may include your session cookie automatically because it is designed to send cookies to the bank site when it makes a request there. If the bank site accepts that request as if it came from you intentionally, the attacker has succeeded. The key idea is that the attacker does not need to steal your session identifier. They just need your browser to use it on their behalf. This is why CSRF is so dangerous. It turns the browser's convenience feature into a weapon. Defending against CSRF requires the site to distinguish between requests the user intentionally initiated and requests that were triggered by a different site. One common approach is to use a per session or per request secret value that must be included in state-changing requests, and that secret value is not automatically sent by the browser in the same way cookies are. Another approach is to use cookie attributes that restrict when cookies are sent in cross-site contexts, reducing the chance that a malicious site can trigger an authenticated request. A third important concept is ensuring that dangerous actions require methods and checks that are harder to trigger accidentally, such as requiring explicit confirmation flows for high-risk transactions. The beginner lesson is that the site must not rely solely on the presence of a session cookie to prove that the user intended the action. Session cookies prove identity continuity, not user intent, and CSRF exploits that gap. Now let's connect this to the broader threat of session theft, because even without CSRF or fixation, attackers often aim to steal session identifiers directly. One classic path is through malicious script execution in the browser, where an attacker's script can read session-related values if they are accessible. Another path is through network interception if session cookies are sent over an unprotected connection or if secure transport is misconfigured. Sessions can also leak through logs, referrer headers, or careless URL design if a site puts sensitive tokens in places that are easily shared. Once an attacker has a valid session identifier, they can often replay it from their own device and appear as the victim. That is why session identifiers are sometimes treated like bearer tokens, meaning possession equals access. In systems where possession is enough, the number one defense is to prevent possession from transferring to the attacker. Session management also includes deciding when sessions expire and how re-authentication works, because an always-on session is convenient but increases risk. If a session lasts for days or weeks, a stolen session remains useful for days or weeks. If a session expires quickly, the user might be annoyed, but the attacker's window is smaller. Many systems use sliding expiration, meaning activity extends the session, but this can unintentionally keep sessions alive far longer than expected if background activity continues. There is also the question of sensitive actions, where a system might require the user to re-authenticate or provide additional proof even if a session exists, because the risk of that action is higher. Beginners sometimes assume that if you are logged in, that should be enough for everything, but secure designs often treat some actions as requiring stronger freshness of authentication. The key point is that session lifetime and reauthentication are policy choices that directly affect how much damage a stolen or abused session can cause. Another subtle issue is session scope, meaning which actions and resources a session allows. If a session automatically grants broad access, then any session abuse is catastrophic. If sessions are scoped more tightly, such as granting only certain permissions or being limited to certain contexts, then the damage of a compromised session can be reduced. That idea shows up in systems that use separate tokens for different purposes, like one token for general identity and another token for performing privileged actions. Even without getting into implementation, you can understand the security principle. Do not give one session artifact unlimited power if you can avoid it. The more powerful the session, the more valuable it is to steal, and the more devastating misuse becomes. A safe design tries to limit what a stolen session can do and to detect when a session is behaving in unusual ways. To wrap up, securing web sessions properly means treating cookies and tokens as powerful credentials that must be protected against theft, guessing, and misuse. Cookies are convenient because browsers send them automatically, but that automatic behavior creates risks like CSRF, which must be mitigated by intent-checking mechanisms and restrictive cookie behavior. Session fixation reminds us that the session identifier must be regenerated when privilege changes, especially at login, so attackers cannot pre-select the session that becomes authenticated. Session theft and replay are constant threats, so secure transport, careful storage, and limited exposure of session values are essential. Finally, session lifetime and scope are not mere usability settings. They are core security controls that decide how long and how far a compromised session can go. If you understand these mechanics, you can evaluate session designs with clear questions, and you can spot when a system is relying on fragile assumptions instead of strong session discipline.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.